Welcome back to another episode of Failure at its Finest Hour. Episode 27 is going to look a little different. This is just Tony here talking to you guys because me, Aaron, and Chris, we all interviewed an individual that I am not going to spoil, but there's some wonderful, wonderful Ontonagon history on the way here, as well on this Halloween day that there's some spooky stories as well. So I'm really looking forward for you guys to hear this. It's a wonderful interview. And before I send it, I wanted to let you know that Dylan, a member here of the podcast, is going to be absent from the podcast for a few months now because he has some military things that he has to tend to. But he will be back closer to Christmas. So it's from here on out until Christmas, it will just be myself, Aaron, and Chris. For right now, well, let's get right into it. All right, we are now joined with a very special guest. Actually, before we even get into it, Aaron and Chris, we kind of talked about having Bruce on. I think early on when we started this podcast, we were talking about kind of ghostly entity stories in Ontonagon. Talked about the orange jogger, Aaron, over by the dump in Greenland, and I swear we talked about, we got to get Bruce Johanson on. Well, we finally did. We have Bruce with us right now. So, Bruce, I just wanted to start off by having you introduce yourself and kind of tell our listener who you are and what you've done for Ontonagon and the community for however many years you've been doing stuff.
Well, my name is Bruce Johanson. I originally came in here as a music teacher. I was a high school band director for a little better than 20 years, all told. I also worked for the Ontonagon Herald for 25 years. I'm kind of retired from that now. I'm trying to retire from it. I was very active with the Ontonagon County Historical Society until about 3 years ago. I served also as the chairman of the board of the Historical Society, and I was instrumental in obtaining ownership of the Lighthouse from the federal government so that the local people could begin restoration of it. My wife and I worked very hard on the restoration, in fact, along with some of the other society members.
So you must have something to do with the tours that they give at the Lighthouse then. That must be something that you were able to implement.
I gave tours for several years, yes. We also conducted our fall haunted lighthouse events.
Man, those were the best.
I put some of those scripts together. It was of course scripted, but it's basically a number of tableaus based on the actual events that we could dredge up of the families who lived there.
Right. And that was always a thing that was one of my favorite things every year was the haunted lighthouse tour. That was something that I thought was really special, especially because I got to be in it a couple times.
Yeah, weren't you and was it you and Tony or you and
my buddy Dylan Thompson?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, Dylan.
Yeah.
My right-hand man at the historical site for many years.
Yeah.
And you guys are actors, right? You guys are actors?
Yes.
Nice.
But like Bruce said, like a lot of it is based on events that happened in the lighthouse over the years, which was fascinating because there's a lot of speculation on whether that lighthouse is haunted or not.
Okay, well, before we go any further, then let's clarify what is meant by these phenomena of haunting. But let's lay down some ground rules first. Your ghost, I hate to use the word ghost, but I will right now. I'd prefer to use the term entities. The entities that we've encountered in various forms in the Ontonagon area, there's a logical explanation. Look, guys, have you ever read A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens?
Yeah.
I don't think I ever have. You guys have, though, but I haven't.
You haven't?
No, I think that's something I probably should do, hey?
Well, then obviously your education and literature has been sadly neglected. Dickens published his famous story, A Christmas Carol, in 1843, which just happens to be the same year Ontonagon was established. He, of course, was British. But you remember, it's a story about an old skinflint miser by the name of Ebenezer Scrooge, who abuses his employees and eventually is haunted by three spirits. There's a complete change in mind and attitude. Now, I'd like you to recall with me some of that story. Bear with me. But when Scrooge comes home and sees the image of Jacob Marley on his door knocker, he's a little taken back. Jacob Marley, of course, is his partner, who's been dead for 7 years. So Scrooge has a real tasty supper of gruel, kind of a gray, watery stuff, and decides to go to bed. And he's awakened in the middle of the night by an entity who introduces himself as the ghost of Christmas past. And Scrooge is invited to step out of bed. The entity takes him by the hand and they walk out the third-story window of his London townhouse. Scrooge pleads, "Look, I'm immortal. I'm going to fall." And they step through the window, and all of a sudden, Scrooge is back in a boyhood setting, walking down a country road, and he sees familiar sights and things he's known years ago. And he says, "Why, spirit? I was a boy here. I see familiar faces." And the the spirit answers back, "These are but shadows of the things that have been. They have no consciousness of us." Now, let me try to make it a little more graphic for you. You guys are watching a football game, see, and this great play has just occurred. And the losing team, or the team that just had this play against them, calls a timeout. So everybody gets off the field, and the announcer there in the radio station says, "Cut to a commercial, quick." So they cut to a commercial. And after the commercial is over, the field comes back on the screen, but the teams aren't back yet. So one of the announcers says, "Let's see that play again." And presto, someone hits a button in the studio, and guess what you're seeing? An instant replay, just as if you were seeing it for the first time. These are the things that were. And those players on the screen now, since it's a replay, have no consciousness of your presence. In other words, what I'm trying to tell you is that the entities we're going to talk about are reflections of the past, things that were or possibly happened. And we can walk amongst these things, and these things can happen around us. And there's no real material connection with us. Forget about the poltergeist throwing things around the room. That's not what we're about today.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about unexplained entities that have been seen and witnessed by people here in the town.
Wow, that's a really good analogy.
That's powerful.
Yeah,
Yeah,
never heard that before. That's great. Oh my goodness.
Now, that being said, where do you want to start? The old school?
I think that's kind of what we were leaning towards. Hey, Aaron.
Yeah, let's run the school, and we can maybe get back to some old Lighthouse logs after.
Oh, you're anxious to get to the lighthouse, aren't you? Well, let's talk about it.
We're interested in it all.
Yeah.
All right.
But yeah, if you could give us kind of a run through of the school, the grade school, to our listeners, so that we can kind of get a glimpse of what the history.
How many of you guys actually attended classes in the old school?
I did it all the way until it closed.
Yeah, we were Chris and I were there. We went
The last year.
Yeah,
Oh.
I moved to Ontonagon when I was in 3rd grade. So from 3rd grade until 6th grade was when I was in that school, and then that year it closed. And I remember, Bruce, you actually came to the school, and you
still taught music.
you
Substitute
had
taught,
those
didn't you?
you had those Halloween tours. You'd bring us up to the 3rd floor in that building. I still
Ah,
remember.
yeah.
I still remember that to this day.
Yeah.
We've all
Well,
been
you're
a
one of
part
the kids I
those.
victimized. Okay.
Right. I couldn't sleep that night after you came to school.
So
Well, that's just fine. But I'm going to recall that one of those stories I told you then. When I speak about the old school, I'm talking about the Ontonagon Township High School building. We're not going to talk. We're not going to mention the what you may have recalled as the central part of the building, the elementary school,
yeah.
which was built in 1938, 39. We're not going to talk about the annex down at the end, that sterile little cardboard box that was built in 1967.
The storage unit.
We're going to talk about the red brick building that's 3 stories high. Okay. And that, I believe the cornerstone says 1912. The building was actually designed by an architect from Menominee named Derek Hubert. And that school has an interesting history. It burned completely gutted by fire in 1929 and to be completely rebuilt. The only thing left was the 4 walls. So it's not the original floor plan it was way back when. And then, lo and behold, in 1949, the building was struck by lightning. And the roof burned off, and there was so much water damage. All the classes, it was in May, all of the classes for the rest of the school year took place in the community building, or what you now call the library theater building. Okay. And then there was another fire in the building, I believe about 1969, when the teacher's lounge burned. So that building, fire has been the instrument of destruction for that building for a long time.
So they built it out of bricks and put a metal roof on it.
Actually, the roof, my friend, and that old building was originally wood. And when the building burned the second time, they put a Waylite concrete roof on it with sheet metal on top of that. And that's what exists today. And by the way, that roof has never leaked. It's a flat roof, but it didn't leak. They did it right. Now back to the story. One of the teaching legends of the school was a fellow by the name of Emil Ora, O-R-A. All the students called him Doc Ora. Now, Doc had been he was a soldier in World War I, and he had been subjected to something called shell shock. So he had a nervous condition, kind of a twitch, and he stammered terribly. He taught mathematics and physics. And his main laboratory was up on the 3rd floor of the building, actually in the southwest corner is where the chemistry lab was. Like I say, Emil Ora had a very pronounced stutter. One of his former students told me that they'd be sitting in a class, and Doc Ora had a big pocket watch he wore with a chain across his vest. He wore a vest. He wore a coat. Always a tie. Carried an umbrella when he came in. He looked like the typical absent-minded professor. And you will see pictures of him if you go to the Ontonagon Township building and look at some of the old class pictures. The most remarkable picture is the last one he appears in, where there's just a radical change in his appearance, like there was suddenly a decline in health. But that's beside the case. One of the school custodians told me this story. He was in the building on a Sunday afternoon. There was a time when that building was heated with coal boilers with interruptible fuel oil. And from time to time, and then eventually they went to natural gas, but they still kept the fuel oil on standby. And if there was a heavy draw on the natural gas lines running into Ontonagon, the school was notified and they had to go and switch over to fuel oil rather than using natural gas for a few hours. So the head custodian had gone in that night and that afternoon on a Sunday to change things over. So he flipped the switch, fired up the boilers on fuel oil. I thought he better sit around for a little while to make sure that the flames work. So he's sitting there in his room, and as he's sitting there, he sees a gentleman walking into the building, coming down the hall, and starting up the stairs. Now, the door is locked. Nobody's supposed to be in the building. So he hollered, hey, can I help you? No reply. The figure just continued walking up the stairs. Well, the custodian got out of his chair and headed up the stairs after whoever this was. And he gets to the second floor, nobody there, but he can hear steps going up to the third floor. Now, at that point, the third floor, you see, had been closed off. It had been closed off for a number of years. At the head of the stairs, there was a fire door that had been erected, so there's no access to that third floor. Yeah, I know. Now I'm going to catch the guy. He gets up to the third floor. The door is still closed. Nobody's there. So he pulls out his keys, opens the door, and walks into the third floor and looks about and sees some movement in the old science lab over in the southwest corner of the building. So he went and looked through the window glass, and he sees this figure walking about, wearing a black lab coat, and moving around and setting up experiments on the science desks that were once fastened down to the floor. Except those science desks aren't there anymore. The outline is still on the floor where these desks were, and this figure is just going about and setting things almost in midair and setting up these experiments, like getting ready to teach a class the next day, which would be a Monday. And so he raps on the door, and the figure doesn't even look up, just keeps on doing what it's doing. Well, that fella he was totally spooked. He headed down the stairs, closed the doors behind him, and told me about it later on. He said, "This is impossible. This couldn't have happened." But obviously it did. Now, I told you that Doc Ora carried a pocket watch on his vest. And one of his students told me, he said, from time to time, the kids would holler out, hey, Doc, what time is it? And Doc Ora would say, it's exactly 10:45. Thank you. And he kept on going. Later, the kids would holler out again, hey, Doc, what time is it? It's about 5 minutes to 11. Thank you. Now, one day, Ora was in the classroom when the kids hollered out what time it was. And Ora looked at his watch. He said, "Oh, excuse me." He says, "It's 2 minutes of noon." Put the watch in his pocket, took off his lab coat, hung it up in the corner of the lab, put on his coat, put on his overcoat, put on his hat, picked up his umbrella, and walked out the door. Went downstairs to the parking lot, got in his black 1948 Buick Torpedo sedan, and drove away. It was later determined that that was the exact minute that he was to retire. And that's the way he retired from the classroom. Simply walked out the door, and that is it. He was a native of Ashland, Wisconsin, I've been told. And I understand that much later, he, after clearing up his affairs in Ontonagon, he went out to the West Coast to visit a brother. I've been unable to get the exact date or circumstances, but Mr. Ora evidently took a plunge off a 5-story window and fell to his death. And they felt it was a suicide. That was within a year of his retirement. Now, so many times we associate. Are you still there? You just went blank. There we are. Tony,
Chris.
Shiner,
Yeah, I'm here.
you disappeared for a moment. There's usually some sort of tragic event that may be associated with the appearance of some of these entities. Now, whether this, the tragic death of Aura, ties in with his return of his entity to, for want of a better word, haunt the halls of the old school, a place where he spent so many years as a teacher, and coming in weekends and setting up the experiments for the students, and as a very dedicated teacher. You find some of the old yearbooks from the 1920s, you'll see Aura very involved in student activities. There were not many yearbooks published during the 1930s because of the Depression. And then again, he reappears in the 1940s and early 50s in the bolder yearbooks of that time. So does the spirit of Doc Aura still walk those halls? Who is to know?
Well, you mentioned his pictures being up at the township building, which is now the library and the theater. And I actually noticed. So I graduated high school in 2014, and we did I forgot what service or ceremony it is for the graduates for the church. Baccalaureate. Yeah. So we did baccalaureate at the theater, and I remember sitting in one of those rooms looking at the pictures. And of course, you know the story. Everyone knows the story of Doc Aura. And I actually noticed on my own what you were talking about how for many years, for 10 years, he seemed to not age at all. And then the last year that he taught,
suddenly the hair is thin.
Right.
He looked great.
He looked completely different. And I noticed that on my own. No one ever told me that. And I looked at it and I was thinking, holy cow, that's the last year. And look at how he looks that last year compared to the last 10. It was unbelievable.
Now, there are a lot of people, I shouldn't say a lot, there are a number of people still in Ontonagon who remember Doc Aura and were actually pupils of his. But most of them at this point would be in their 90s. So you'd have to ask around a bit.
Yeah.
The late Vic Kiefer, superintendent of schools, told me this much about Doc Aura, about his personal life. He was a bachelor, by the way. He had a mother who lived in Ashland, Wisconsin. So often he'd run down to Ashland to make sure she was all right. But he never. Well, anyway, so much for poor Doc Aura and the haunted science lab of the old school. By the way, when's the last time you guys were in that building?
It's been a long time, but I'm dying to get in there. I really am.
Well, I just happen to have a key, Mr. Shiner.
Oh,
you have a key?
Gosh.
Of course I have.
Wow.
My wife is super fascinated with the whole building. And I think the whole place is really, the masonry work in that school is some of the craziest masonry work and glass work you'll ever see, especially like in the kindergarten room. That was one of the coolest things in the world.
Chris, if you walked in there today, it'll break your heart.
Really?
The building's been without heat, without electricity, without any real maintenance now since 2011.
It's horrible.
And a building that is just, the condition is still quite salvageable, but it's deteriorating quickly. If you guys are really interested in taking a private tour and are willing to agree that if you break a leg, you're not going to hold me liable. The old school does now belong to the village of Ontonagon. Really? And I am a member of the Greenland Road School Commission. And we've been charged with the mission of trying to find an alternative use for that school building. And we certainly like to see it saved.
Because I know that didn't somebody buy it years back and just nothing happened to it? And
yes, a gentleman by the name of Michael G. Melby, MGM, purchased it, as well as the former Maple Manor, which was the original Ontonagon Memorial Hospital. Then he chose not to do anything with those buildings, shut off the heat, shut off the electricity, and everything went to heck.
It's a bummer.
The old school finally went up for taxes, and the village was given the opportunity to acquire the building. And at that time, I was still on the Ontonagon County Historical Society board. And I urged the village to grab that. Consider the alternative.
Do you know what the what it went for? Was there like an undisclosed price or?
I mean, the first time it was sold,
Yeah,
roughly
or
$40,000 for the whole thing.
$40,000.
$40,000 only.
And
Wow.
that included all three buildings, the school bus garage, the old athletic field, and quite a bit of acreage as well.
Wow.
And what did the historical society or the village nab it back from him for?
The taxes.
Just the
They paid
taxes.
some of the taxes.
Okay.
Pay the
Paid some of
taxes.
the taxes.
Wow. He wasted all that. He bought it for 40 grand and didn't do anything with it. That's crazy. Wow.
Yes, it is.
Oh, 40 grand in taxes. Well, that's pretty interesting. I haven't heard that story about the school in a long time. But next time we're all in Ontonagon, we should definitely indulge in a
Yes.
visit to the school.
I will definitely accept that invite to get a private tour. That'd be awesome.
Yeah.
Maybe in the spring or summer when it's a little warmer in there.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Oh, but this time of year is a good time to be in there when it's cooler and damp and dark.
Creepy. Yep.
So Doc Ora didn't have any descendants. Did he have any?
No.
Did he have any siblings that had kids? So like any nephews running
I
around?
know nothing about the brother on the West Coast.
Okay.
I
One
wish I
brother on
could.
the West Coast.
I wish I had more information on that. He sounded like a real interesting fellow.
Yeah.
I know that he was a special courier during World War One, carrying messages from the various one trench to another in France.
Really.
Like I say, he was shell shocked and had
Yes.
this nervous condition.
Yeah, that's a horrifying job.
How fascinating is it to think that brother out on the West Coast, if he's got descendants that are still around today, and there are a couple of kids from Michigan still talking about this and still bringing up this story.
The Ontonagon Lighthouse, you want to talk about?
Right into it.
Yeah.
Yes. I love it.
Let's go. So I guess my first question that I have about the Lighthouse is a little bit, maybe not as much on the restoration process, which I'm sure was extensive, but acquiring it from the federal government. Was that like a Coast Guard thing, or maybe you can talk to us about acquiring it?
Well, I'll tell you about that. There had been attempts to get ownership of the lighthouse by people in the village for a long time. And one plan was to actually pick it up and move it over to where the Riverside Park is now and use it kind of as a tourist information center.
Gotcha.
You have any idea what's involved in picking up a masonry building and moving it?
Probably too much for the little town of Ontonagon.
Not impossible. How many of you are familiar with the lighthouse at Sand Point in Baraga?
I've heard of it.
I don't think I have been there or seen that. No.
Well, you have to drive out onto the Ojibwe Recreation Area and follow the signs. There's a little lighthouse out there. It's similar to Ontonagon's, but smaller in scale. Back in the 1890s, that lighthouse was actually picked up. I mean, it's a brick lighthouse, actually jacked up, put on greased skids, and slid 300 feet back away from the lakeshore where it was being threatened with erosion and was set back down to its current location.
Wow.
So it is possible to move these buildings. But getting back to the Ontonagon Lighthouse, once it belonged to the Coast Guard. The old lighthouse service was abolished by orders of President Franklin Roosevelt in 1939 as a economy measure, and charge of and the care of all of the lighthouses was then turned over to the United States Coast Guard. So after 1939, all of the lighthouse keepers actually were Coast Guardsmen.
Okay.
Now, when the lighthouse was decommissioned on January 1st, 1964, the Coast Guard turned it over to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The Detroit district has control of the Ontonagon Harbor. They're the ones who arrange for the dredging of the harbor, maintaining it, putting up the break walls, and so forth and so forth. And now the Corps of Engineers, it's a big, how do you say, foggy bottom bureaucracy. They do bridges, they do harbors, they do dikes, they do break walls, breakwaters, and so forth. They don't do lighthouses. So it was just something they got stuck with. The local U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary then used it as a clubhouse for a while, under license with the Corps of Engineers. But little by little, they maintained it, kind of. But it hadn't really taken care of, and they kept heat in it as well. But it really hadn't been taken care of. The Historical Society began to show an interest in it when a lot of people wanted to go through it. We got a license, a permit to take people through the lighthouse. But what was there to show them? A derelict building that had sagging floors, glass falling out of the windows, paint peeling inside. It really wasn't much to see. Actually, if you've been over to Marquette, Michigan, and looked at their lighthouse, those folks haven't done a darn thing to theirs either.
Really? Because that's where I'm living right now in Marquette.
Go look at that lighthouse, and you say, why an affluent community like Marquette is letting that lighthouse look the way it does, but they do. Nevertheless, we decided to do something about Ontonagon. So several of us guys got together. The late David Corbett, John Doyle, Bruce Rudla, and myself. And we sat down over a chicken dinner one day in Dave Corbett's kitchen and talked about the lighthouse. And Corbett said, why don't we just go for ownership? Well, it's been tried so many times before. No, let's really go at it this time. So we divvied up the chores. Rudla and Doyle, of course, was the former maintenance man at Smurfit Stone. He knows buildings. Rudla is very handy with his hands and very resourceful. They were going to go in and stabilize the building as much as they were allowed to. They're allowed to, because the Corps of Engineers didn't really want to doing much to change it.
Just refurb it, kind of rehab it.
Not even do that. Just try to glass falls out of the window, put some stick it back in. Try to hold it together. In the meantime, Dave Corbett said, "I'll deal with the local politicians and the people who want to pick up and move it." We were adamant we didn't want it moved. We did not want it moved. And it was fortunate for us that back in 1976, a gal from the State Historic Preservation Office had rushed through Ontonagon and slapped two of the historic buildings on the National Register of Historic Places. One being the old courthouse, and the other one being the Ontonagon Lighthouse. So it already had designation as a historical site. So Corbett was going to take care of that. And I said, well, what do you want me to do? Well, they said, oh, you get the best job of all. You get to deal with the Corps of Engineers. You gotta get them to give it to you. Oh, Instead, I tried a little different tack. I got a hold of our U.S. congressional representative, Bart Stupak. And I also got a hold of our U.S. senator at that time. Come on, you civic students. Who was the senator of the United States who served the U.S. Senate?
You guys, Aaron, you got this. Aaron, you know it.
I'm afraid
Chris,
we're all
you got
in the
it.
dark on this one.
I don't know.
Chris, you know it. Come on.
You remember Carl Levin?
Nope.
Embarrassing
Mr.
ourselves.
Shiner, your civics education has also been grossly.
It ain't just. It's not just civics, sir.
a lot of subjects, sir.
I contacted Senator Levin's office as well. Told him we really wanted the lighthouse in the worst way. There were a lot of things we had to go through. Asbestos abatement, anything that would be, that's a big deal. There was a huge fuel oil tank sitting on the lighthouse grounds, oozing and dripping fuel oil into the soil. That had to be removed, and then all of the soil dug up around that tank and replaced with fresh soil. Well, that is beyond our capabilities. But Senator Levin and Bart Stupak, without going into all of the details, finally in 1990, an omnibus bill went through the Congress called the Water Resources Development Act, nicknamed WARDA, Water Resources Development Act. And this was what's going to pay for all of the funding for the Sulaks operation, maintenance way down at the other end of the peninsula, dredging the Ontonagon Harbor. The mill was still operating at that time. They still had coal boats coming on a regular basis. The harbor had to be dredged. Breakwaters had to be maintained. And stuck on the bottom of the Water Resources Development Act of 1990 was a tiny little 2 lines that said, the Secretary of the Army is directed to convey to the Ontonagon County Historical Society the Ontonagon Lighthouse and everything that goes with it. Well, no one, even half the Congress doesn't bother to read these bills anyway. So it was signed, sealed, delivered. We received notification that the bill had been signed. We still couldn't do anything because now the Corps of Engineers had to go in there and they had to dig out that fuel tank. They had to dig out all of the soil. Their army. Finally, in the end, we're told, you've got the lighthouse. Fine. We actually got the deed. The deed arrived at the Ontonagon Historical Society by special delivery. Within 20 minutes, I was at the courthouse getting that deed registered. Now it belongs to the Ontonagon Historical Society. Now, is the lighthouse haunted?
That's the question, right?
That's why you're here.
Well, haunting isn't the word. It's reflections.
That lighthouse is the oldest standing lighthouse on the Keweenaw.
Wow.
A lot of people don't realize that the Ontonagon Lighthouse is older than Copper Harbor's by
Really?
6 weeks.
6
And by the way,
weeks.
they're about 6 weeks. They're built off of very similar plans. But the Ontonagon Lighthouse was lit first. It is the oldest standing lighthouse still on the Keweenaw.
Wow.
Now, I say on the Keweenaw, there's an older lighthouse out on the island off the tip of Copper Harbor.
Standard Rock.
No, Standard Rock is way out in the middle of the sticks.
Okay. Gotcha.
And I'm not thinking about Gull Rock. I'm thinking about the other one, the bigger one. And that particular lighthouse, which is identical to the one at Whitefish Point, is dates from 1861. So it's even older.
Wow.
By the way, when the Lighthouse Service found a lighthouse design late, they made a lot of them. So you've got Ontonagon, you've got Copper Harbor, you've got the one on Huron Island. Let me see. There's a whole pile of them. Granite Island over by Marquette, Grand Island North over by Munising, Gull Rock. They're all basically the same lighthouse as the Ontonagon Lighthouse. Okay? Now, by daylight, you walk in that lighthouse. It's a very unassuming building. The windows are open. It's bright. It's airy, especially if the window's open. You've been in there. You know well as it can be. Although in the last year, has been changed quite a bit due to new management over at the museum. I'm not in agreement with some of the changes they've made, but I'm no longer involved, so I don't have anything to say about it anymore.
just have your opinions, right? That's all you can do now.
The Ontonagon Lighthouse was constructed of Milwaukee Cream City brick, which itself makes it remarkable it's still standing because it does not weather well. The first that first lighthouse, by the way, the Ontonagon light, the one that's out there now, is not the first lighthouse to stand in Ontonagon. It's not the first.
Nope.
Right next to the current lighthouse, a little closer to the river, was the original lighthouse that was built in 1851.
Wow.
And it wasn't even lit until 1853, when the first lighthouse keeper in Ontonagon, a guy named Samuel Peck, took charge of it. And then the next lighthouse keeper in Ontonagon was a guy named Michael Spellman. And Mike Spellman he was a town jailer. Yeah, the jailer. He also is the first live burial in the Catholic cemetery in 1881.
Oh, wow.
Amongst his other distinctions. But he was the lighthouse keeper from 1857 until 1862. And then in 1862, a mysterious fellow named Adolphus Schuler, the third lighthouse keeper, takes over, and he runs it from 1862 till 1864. Now, this, of course, puts us into the Civil War period. Now, one of the most colorful lighthouse keepers and one of our entities is a fellow named Thomas Stripe. And I'm sure you've heard of Thomas Stripe. The Stripe family is still around Ontonagon. They're a very prominent family. They're a pioneering family. Thomas Stripe first arrived in Ontonagon in 1849, working for the Hudson's Bay Company. He's the fellow who was involved in that 4th of July accident in 1859, when the ceremonial firing of a cannon caused him to lose his right arm.
Oh, man.
You've heard that story?
It's coming back to me
I
now.
think it is.
I recall this. I recall this feller quite well.
Poor Thomas Stripe, handicapped as he was given the job of lighthouse keeper. And he held that job from 1864 until 1883, quite a long time.
Wow, yeah.
And some of the and a lot of the lighthouse journal entries that we have, and until recently, the Ontonagon County Historical Society actually was in possession of that handwritten lighthouse keeper's journal. Now, I understand that the current management of the museum has sent it off to Washington, so it's no longer here. However, for my own part, I got my hands on it and had it in my hands for a few months, during which time I transcribed it. It was all handwritten in cursive, of course. And I transcribed it. And then later on, we obtained from the National Archives the other lighthouse keepers' journals that actually had been sent to Washington. So it took me 3 years to transcribe all of these journals, right from 1872 up until 1953 when they ended. And those lighthouse keepers' journals are still available for sale at the Ontonagon County Historical Society Museum.
Dang.
All there. And as I was going through, I began to find some very interesting things. Things we found out about the lighthouse that no one would have had any idea. For example, we didn't know that the original wainscoting was buried under some wood paneling in what is now the office. And once we peeled off the wood paneling, there was the original green wood paneling that Thomas Stripe would have been sitting in front of while he was filling out his lighthouse keeper's journals. there's some remarkable things.
Yeah.
Um,
It
anyway,
is.
Tom Stripe will then serve as the lighthouse keeper till 1883, when James Corrigan will take over. And Corrigan's also a very colorful and noted lighthouse keeper who was there then until 1919. I won't go any farther than that right now. I'm only throwing too many things against you. I can already see Mr. Shiner's attention begin to wane. Now,
Hey, I got a zoo of children in my house that I'm.
all right. The first keeper to work in the current lighthouse, was Tom Stripe. And he's earned a place in local history for several of his local exploits. The tragic loss of his arm, saving Ontonagon from starvation during an exploit with dog sleds going over the ice to Eagle River to pick up the winter supplies. All sorts of wonderful things he did. Tough little Irishman he was. Stripe is actually, pardon me?
Did he have a family in the lighthouse with him, or was he just by himself?
Yes. Oh, yes.
Oh, okay.
Mr. and his wife, Catherine. I believe that there were 6 children.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Now, he also owned a house in town, of course. So during the winter time, of course, the lighthouse is closed down. So he was a village resident. And in the spring, he'd move out to the lighthouse and the light. He writes in his journal, and it's hard to imagine the lighthouse as being surrounded by forest and a wildlife area at that time. He talks about his sons going out and hunting geese on the river, catching fish in the river, hunting in the woods around the lighthouse, and cooking. His wife cooking wild game in the lighthouse kitchen. Yes, they had quite a family. He and his wife slept in the one bedroom in the lighthouse, and the kids all bunked in the big spacious floor on the top, one big room on the floor. And the top floor is now partitioned into several rooms. Okay. Mr. Stripe, or Mrs. Stripe, by the way, suffered a serious injury by falling down the lighthouse stairs, and she became an invalid, which probably caused him to have to retire in 1883 and leave early to go home to care for her. He lived until 1899. And James Corrigan, who was the regular keeper after that, notes several times that he was visited by Mrs. Stripe, who came back over the lighthouse to just kind of visit the old shop and make sure things are going right. Now, Mr. Stripe is one of our entities who's actually been seen on 2 occasions. Once at night, walking on the gallery around the lighthouse tower, up on top. And the other time was during a tour, oddly enough, during a lighthouse tour, recent times. The tour was in the large bedroom, and the fellow who was giving the tours at that time, Mr. John Murray, there was 2 couples, 2 ladies and 2 gentlemen, and Mr. Murray was well in his 80s at that time, so he had a little trouble opening and closing the trap door up at the top of the tower. So he'd only take up 2 people at a time, so he wouldn't have to lift and lower that trap door. They just went through it, came back out. You have to go through the tour. Maybe you've had a lighthouse tour, you know what I'm talking about. So while he was upstairs in the tower with these 2 guys showing them the lighthouse, in the meantime, the 2 ladies
You can
are
grab
down
that
below
phone call if you'd like.
and they're kind of poking and snooping around, opening drawers in the dresser. And oddly enough, they see that, there's linens in the closets and in the dressers. Everything's just the way it should be, because we were very fastidious. and setting the lighthouse up as if somebody actually lives there. And indeed, those entities still do. But
Do you know what year that was? The tour, like when they.
that particular tour, it would have been in the early 2000s.
Okay. And then do you know the time when someone saw him out on the observation deck or up on the what you said, like out on top of the lighthouse there by the light? Do you know when that was?
Yes, that was before that time. Dylan Thompson, your friend,
Yeah.
is the one who actually saw Thomas Stripe
Oh wow.
on the Gap. Dylan, but different story. Let's get back to the two ladies in the bedroom. They're poking around up there, you see. So what do? One of the ladies goes and opens the closet door. And we keep old junk up there, brooms, a couple of plastic totes and so forth. She opens the closet door, and a guy steps out of the closet into the room, and tips his hat into them. Uses his left hand, tips his hat, a lighthouse keeper's hat, off his head, and then smiles, turns around, walks down the aisle, down the hall. One of the ladies noticed that his right sleeve was cut off. There's nothing there. All right. Now, so one said to the other, "Did you see that?" Well, yeah, who was that? They looked down the hall, down the aisle. Nobody's there. Well, when their husbands came down, John took the ladies up. Nothing more was said about it till the next day. I'm at the museum. And somebody they come into the museum. They said, "That guy who popped out of the closet for our wives, who was that?" I said, "What are you talking about?" "Well, we didn't get to see that. We missed part of the show. Where was that guy?" I said, "Please describe what you saw." And they described to me what they had seen. And we didn't have anybody sitting in the closet to pop out at anybody. This was a spontaneous appearance by one of the entities. All right?
You must probably have been freaking out when they started to describe his appearance, and once they got to the left arm being sliced, right arm, you must have been just like, "How was that?" Like
Mr. Stripe, you understand, was right-handed, and so his lighthouse journals are quite cryptic, and sometimes they're different handwritings. Like maybe he got somebody else to do his journal entries, because obviously he was having trouble writing with a left hand that he'd never used for writing, because he was right-handed. Now, the other time when he was spotted in the gallery, Dylan Thompson was down in the yard. He had been given special permission to spend the night in the lighthouse. His parents were there too. Now they were sleeping upstairs, and at that time we didn't have restroom facilities at the lighthouse, but we had one of those porta johns sitting out on the lawn. So Dylan went out in the middle of the night to do what he had to do, and he comes out of the porta john. He glances up at the tower. Now, back then we were still hooked up to the paper mill power plant, so we still had electricity out there. So we ran the light in the tower on a electric eye all night. We had actually placed a large bulb up there in the tower, so lighthouses would be seen, And Dylan looks up and he sees a figure standing up there on the gallery, and the figure looks down at him. Now that's some distance away, but it's still you can see clear. But the light was behind, so it was like what you saw was a shadow or a silhouette, but definitely a person. And the figure waves at him with his left arm, stepped over behind and out of sight on the other side of the tower, and gone. And you ask Dylan about that, he will swear that he saw this.
wow, that's incredible. So it's only been the two sightings
Well,
that you know of?
there's a sighting. There's a photograph. I know.
Oh, you've seen that.
Of me and Dylan Thompson. And where we were in front of the master bedroom, weren't we? It was that night after we did the Lighthouse tour, the haunted lighthouse, and we had the dinner. And my mom had taken a photo of Dylan and I in front of the bedroom at the end of the hallway there. And between our heads, it looks like there's something. I don't know if I can depict it or not, but it is. I haven't seen this photo since it's been taken. I don't know where it is.
We've got to get our hands on that.
There have been some camera images, nothing we can really set down to. Now, there was a team that came over from NMU a few years back, and they asked to spend the night in the lighthouse. They had some sound equipment and so forth. They're trying to research psychophenomena. They determined that there was something there, but nothing that they could define or lay out.
There was some sort of energy that there was.
Yeah, but it could have been anything. Depends how sensitive your instruments are. Could have been even just a fluorescent light going on, Now, the other big ones that come to mind at the Ontonagon Lighthouse, I told you, the lighthouse also has suffered fire. Suffered a fire in 1899 when a sparks came out of the chimney, set the cedar shake roof ablaze, and burned out the whole southwest corner of the building. At that time, the Corrigan sons, James Corrigan and his boys, put up ladders, and his wife was down there pumping water like crazy out of the cistern in the kitchen, and they put the fire up for the fire department even got there, and they basically saved the lighthouse. But the other time the lighthouse was threatened by fire, of course, was on August 25th, 1896. And that date should mean something to you if you've grown up in Ontonagon.
That's the big Ontonagon fire.
The Diamond
That
Match
was the
Company.
Great Fire of Ontonagon
Yeah.
in 1896.
Yep.
Now, before I get to that, in 1876, July 8th, 1876, a steam freighter named the St. Clair pulled out of the Ontonagon Harbor, carrying a few passengers and, believe it or not, some livestock as well. There were hogs and sheep on the deck, and I think at least one cow. And they were on their way to Houghton. The St. Clair was a real junky ship, okay? It had been, if you ask me sometime about the history of shipwrecks, I can go into that in a little more detail. On that particular night, July 8th, 1876, the St. Clair caught fire off a 14-mile point. Now, back in those days, from the Ontonagon Tower, the shipyard building that we know is there now did not obstruct the view, and you could actually see almost a 14-mile point. It didn't quite stick up past 10 mile.
Wow.
But the St. Clair caught fire out in the lake, and the captain headed that vessel for shore. It was a tragic event, only 3 survivors in the end. But it is said that on some clear nights in July, the image of the past often replays itself again before our mortal eyes. Because from the lighthouse tower until it disappears behind the shipyard building, you can see that burning St. Clair moving toward 14-mile point and then disappears.
Wow.
Holy cow. I've never heard that before.
Oh, well,
The ghost ship thing is actually something we have like kind of talked about a little bit, but we never could remember what the exact story was that maybe.
well, there's another ghost story. ghost ship story too, but that I experienced myself. But let's get back to the lighthouse.
Hey,
In 1896, the lighthouse was threatened by fire, and James Corrigan, being an old-time lighthouse keeper, by God, in the tradition of the sea, he's going to go down with his lighthouse. So him and his wife and a hired girl and a son, young Tom, were in the lighthouse at that time. And as the fire began to approach the lighthouse, they dipped water out of the river, ran up the lighthouse stairs and up into the tower and threw the water onto the roof of the building to wet it down
jeez.
from igniting. Many, many times they did this. Imagine the heat, the air,
Oh.
your windpipe as you're struggling, and your eyes are just burning from the smoke because the wind was coming from the southwest, blowing right toward the lighthouse.
Mm.
Now, it is said, and it has been reported, that every so many years, on August 25th, falls on a Tuesday, which was the actual day of the fire, Tuesday, August 25th. It's been reported that the entire scene is reenacted in silhouette. It's been reported that the entire scene, no one can be seen in the tower. But if you get down, actually, if you get up in the tower and look out on the lawn, you will see the reflection of that tower at that time of the afternoon. The sun is behind you, and you will see figures moving around you, carrying what appears to be pails and dumping things off the edge of the railing and then disappearing again. It clearly shows the movement of figures on the lighthouse gallery, carrying pails and pouring the contents on that roof. And by the way, the wind shifted and blew the fire away and saved the lighthouse.
Now, can we get that tour on that night?
You'll have to talk. Well, it's first of all, that tour is about 4:00 in the afternoon, our time. It's in daylight because you're talking about shadows caused by the sun on the lawn. So you'll have to talk to and you'll have to show up on a Tuesday, August 25th. Check your calendar. It happens every so many years.
Marking it now.
That's where you are. All right. Who wanted to talk about the jogger on the Greenland Road?
That was Aaron. Or Aaron and I both want to hear it because we both
Yeah.
have heard about that and actually have gone out trying to seek for it. Actually, I mean, that was when we were really young and really bored.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's see here. Tell you what I'm going to do. I wrote this down, so I'm going to read it to you. You mind?
Perfect.
No.
Oh, perfect.
No,
That's
we don't
great.
mind.
Our next tale is mysterious, and that though there are several persons who have experienced this strange happening, there is a difference in the accounts, and yet a similarity of circumstances. Now, the first incident involves a young man driving home at night on M26, the Greenland Road, of course. I'm sorry, M38. Boy, I should know my geography better than that. M38. Yeah. My wife just corrected me too. The fellow was making good time when suddenly, out of nowhere, a man on foot appeared right in front of him. It was too quick and too late to avoid the inevitable. He hit the brakes and closed his eyes, braced for the impact. Then nothing. Nothing. He got out of the car and looked around. Nothing. No one. No damage to the car. Absolutely no sign of anyone on the road. Well, he continued home somewhat shaken and awaited the news the next morning of a hit and run on the Greenland Road. Still nothing. He is still absolutely certain to this day that something or someone was out there in front of his car that he hit. Now, the next report It involves a lone individual, this time described as a jogger. This motorist now is approaching the area near the landfill. When in the headlights, he caught sight of a lone jogger wearing a bright orange jogging outfit. I've heard the story a couple of times. Sometimes it's a green jogging suit. But the first time I heard it was orange, running against traffic. So the individual's running on the right side, on the correct side of the road. He slowed a bit, but just as he was passing the runner, the figure in orange seemed to stumble and fall in front of the car. Then there was a thud. He stopped, jumped out of the car to surrender aid. No one there. Not a sign of anyone. Now, another account, the jogger is encountered in a snowstorm. It gets better now, snowstorm. You know how our lake effect snows can be up here. The same location near the landfill is given as the place of the encounter. But this time the runner throws himself in the path of the car. And there's a feeling of an impact. The driver stops to see what happened and finds nothing. But in this account, different than the others, there's a broken headlight on the car on the passenger side. Now, I've told you that there's no connection with these entities with physical. So this doesn't make sense, but it's inconsistent with what I'm telling you. Now, the mystery of the unidentified pedestrians moving along M38 continues. In this account, the driver, she told me the story herself, Mrs. R, never mind the name, was driving toward Greenland on M38 at night, and a large truck was approaching in the northbound lane. So she's going toward Mass City. This truck is coming up. She could see in the lights of the truck a tall man walking on the wrong side of the road. That is, not facing traffic. On her side of the road, but not facing traffic. She could discern clearly that the man was wearing a denim jacket and blue jeans and had a chook on his head. You probably call him a stocking cap. No, a chuck. No, not a beanie, a chuck. No, kind of a knit cap you pulled on. She thought she recognized the man and thought maybe his car had broken down, he might need a ride. But as she continued toward Greenland, she saw no car on the road, so she kept on going. And then a short time later, she heard the same account from a neighbor who had seen the same mysterious walker at night making his way along the Greenland road heading toward Ontonagon with no sign of a disabled vehicle in sight. So who or what are several people witnessing while driving along the Greenland road at night? Is our walker related in some way to the jogger who actually interacts with motorists? Who knows what or whom you might meet walking along our highways in Ontonagon County at night? And of course, that's just a little ways up from the poor farm.
Right. I was just going to ask, is there any significance in that? Like, there is no explanation, there's no story of somebody that was jogging in that area that had gotten hit?
Nothing. Absolutely nothing.
Wow, that's interesting.
And another thing that's very bizarre is that there's like nothing around there. When you're like,
that's right.
When you're going by there,
yeah,
it's a
true.
Vast expanse of nothing. Beautiful view when you're coming into Ontonagon down from that hill. But there's nowhere for somebody to just pop out of nowhere. That's kind of the most chilling thing about it.
So I guess I want to tell you a story that I had with Aaron. Actually was with me, and I was with another friend in that same area.
Sure.
Just after the dump there. We were coming back from Houghton. We watched a movie, and I was in the passenger seat of the car. My buddy was driving, and up ahead, again, this was just after the landfill there, we saw what looked like reflectors on a bike that were rotating across the road. and it was just the reflector lights. Didn't see if it was an actual bike. Couldn't see the spokes, the seat, a person. But we just saw these lights kind of going in this circular direction across the road, like somebody was on a bike going across. And it hit the ditch, and we still saw the lights going down into the ditch, and then it just kind of disappeared into the woods. And we had gotten out, and of course we were freaking out. And we got out and looked to see if there was a bike or somebody that was on the side of the road, and there was nothing. And that was along kind of the same stretch of highway there. So I don't know if that's related or not, but that was just our experience.
Another thing that's weird with that story, if you've ever been like at like a stoplight and there's a crosswalk, and you've seen somebody, in your car, you've seen somebody jogging by, and I never thought about this until right now. It's kind of weird. But if somebody's jogging by and they have like actual runner shoes that have reflective tape on the side of them, it's not a complete circular pattern, obviously, like a tire. And I was actually asleep, I think, in the back seat of that car, and I don't remember it.
I mean, at the time, maybe it looked like it.
Yeah, and I don't know, but if you've seen that, those reflectors on those shoes are very. I mean, they're when your headlights hit those, you see them right away.
Yeah.
So kind of a weird. I mean, maybe a bit of a stretch. And like I said, I was not awake for it, but I just had that thought.
So let's talk about the poor farm.
Yeah,
because I feel like not a lot of people know the history of that. I don't know. I just haven't, because we always see the building coming in Ontonagon, and it's just you don't know anything about it. At least I never knew.
Yeah.
All right, we'll start with a history lesson.
Sure.
First of all, there's been a poor farm in Ontonagon since 1854. Not that building, but approximately 204 acres was set aside as a place for indigent citizens to spend their last days. Crippled lumberjacks, miners who had silicosis of the lungs, old lumberjacks who were stove up from working in the woods and they're too stiff with arthritis to work anymore. It'd be someplace for them to go. And you didn't have a Department of Social Services from the state of Michigan in those days. Each county took care of its own. And Ontonagon County did its part. Finally, and eventually became quite an enterprise. There was a large farm out there, an L-shaped barn, a silo, a fine herd of registered Holstein dairy cattle, a pig barn, a horse barn, a granary, a chicken house, and of course the main infirmary. And out behind the infirmary was another building, which was the tuberculosis sanitarium. And all of this was run by Ontonagon County. Kind of like it would correspond to the long-term care facility that has now been closed down by Aspirus, but which was to take care of people. All right? Mm-hmm. That particular building out there was built in 1900. It took 10 boxcar loads of brick to construct that building. It's a huge manor house. It had facilities for both men and women. Doctors visited on a regular basis. There's a huge central dining hall inside. They also had the dairy for the barn or for the farm located in the basement where they actually processed the milk. The county farm was actually a self-sustaining facility. And those patients who were capable of working, a lot of these older people don't want to feel useless, so they're given chores to do, like feed the animals, take care of the pigs, muck out the stalls in the barn, help with the planting, help with the haying a little bit. They were given chores and duties as they were able to do. In fact, the entire record of the patients at that farm were in the possession of the Ontonagon County Historical Society, again until recently, but I believe it's been digitized as available online. There's some very interesting names you see in there. Anyway, a quick review of those records reveals a number of maladies and afflictions. A lot of them related to occupations, like black lung caused by inhaling dust following the blasts in the mines. A number of illnesses, dropsy, blindness, pneumonia, strokes, rheumatism, and even insanity. There were people actually incarcerated there who were insane. Tuberculosis was on the rise. This required a special isolation. So that was taken care of in the back. Oddly enough, tuberculosis is very prevalent among Native Americans. And oddly enough, there's a high incidence of it also among Finnish Americans. And you know that the population here is heavily laced with those people from Northern Europe. Now, one patient especially comes to mind, a fellow by the name of Richard Langford, Langford. Now, I'm sorry, I'm falling into my classroom method of spelling. You're supposed to be writing this down, of course, as I give it to you.
Yeah. Pop quiz in a little bit here.
All right. He was admitted to the poor farm in 1908. He had diabetes. Of course, that's back in the days before they had insulin and other medications. So and he was, they figured he was about 75 years old, 78. And his diabetes had caused him to go blind. He lost his vision. And they called him the hermit of Lake Gogebic because he lived down on Lake Gogebic in a shack. But since this was a part of Ontonagon County, the authorities brought him kicking and screaming to the poor farm to spend his last days. And they were just concerned about the old man, you know. So he's taken to the county farm for care, and he died after a few weeks as a patient. But Mr. Langford is remembered today as the fellow who discovered iron ore on the Gogebic Range. He was the one who first called attention to the fact that there was iron ore. He discovered on a hill right beside the current day city of Bessemer, the Colby, they called it the Colby mine. And he never got a dime for his discovery.
I was going to say, did he get royalties or something? That's unfortunate.
Never got a,
wow.
He was promised royalties. He was cheated out of the whole thing. But as he lay there dying in the poorhouse, raving, he said, please take me back to my shack. He said, I can tell you where the silver is. And he related a huge vein of silver embedded in a rock on the banks of Lake Gogebic. Now, this is back in the days before Lake Gogebic was dammed up to its current depth. So that vein of silver is probably now under the shallow waters of Lake Gogebic, which is basically an artificial lake, you know.
Oh, I didn't know that, no.
Oh, really? You didn't take my class, did you? Now, the infirmary building had amongst its other features patients in their last agony of life who might be moaning and groaning and suffering, but what are they going to do? There was a special room up in the vault, in the attic, under the high vaulted ceiling, called the dying room, where these patients were brought up into the attic, and they were fed and looked after, but they were making so much noise that other patients couldn't sleep. So they were kept up there until they expired. And if you go up in the attic right now, you will see names written on those rafters and dates. It's fascinating. They go, and that building is not going to be standing much longer.
No, it doesn't look too good.
And it's dangerous to go into now, but I've been in there when it was a good sound building, and I took a group of 4-Hers through there 4 years ago. And we photographed and took pictures of a lot of these names and so forth. Anyway, after the people expired, they were then placed in caskets in a cold northeast corner of the building where they would keep until such time as the undertaker came out from Ontonagon, collected the caskets, might be 2 or 3 at a time, and bring them out to the Evergreen Cemetery to the Potter's Field, where then they'd be buried. And all of those graves were at one time had little metal markers on them. Then someone got tired of mowing around these markers and hitting with a lawnmower. So they're all yanked up. So now there's no, you can't even find them anymore. I went out there one day and all of a sudden all the markers are gone. However, a lot of people, high in the evening, through the night. If you go over there near the old Candlelight Club,
Yeah.
and you look off toward the port farm, you can sometimes see what appears to be lights flickering in some of the windows. As few and some of the windows are broken out now, so you're not seeing this as much. I lived in that neighborhood at one time, and we could see from our front door blue lights flickering at the port farm.
Wow. Holy cow.
So you have to ask yourself, do the spirits of the poor old soup-bone lumberjacks or the injured miners who died in this house, do they still move about those rooms where they spent the last months or days of their mortal lives?
Aaron and I have always, every time we've gone past that building, have always talked about how awesome it'd be to go in there, but obviously seeing the condition it's in right now. Do you know who owns that property or that building? Is it?
It is private property. You have no business going in there.
Sure.
Without a member of the family with you.
Right. And I think I saw even on Facebook somebody went there without permission, and there was this big. Did you see that too, Aaron?
I saw it. I was going to ask about it.
It almost seemed like there were people from out of town that didn't know that you couldn't go in there. Because I'm not sure. I've never even approached the building at all. I don't know if there's signs or if there's.
I was at the building, right next to it, taking several photographs last December, because my daughter, my son-in-law, and myself constructed a scale model of that building, and it's now in the museum. You can go in there and see it, so you can see what it looked like. We included the pump house behind and the windmill that used to stand behind it as well as a part of the building.
I guess I wanted to ask: is there any experience that you've had personally? But I know you just said you saw the blue lights flickering in the old poor farmhouse, but has there ever been an experience that it looks like you're digging there? It looks like you may have something for us. Because I've always wondered if you've ever experienced anything out of the ordinary.
Yes.
Anything you care sharing with us? Or
this was in the summer of 1967. That was probably before you were even a gleam in your daddy's eye. Right?
No.
It was a clear day in the morning hours of July. At that time, we were living out near the township park on Lakeshore Drive. There was a gentle breeze from the east. I'd gone outside and walked toward the beach when I clearly saw the ship. Now, so you understand where this actually was. You know where the Ontonagon Township Park is, of course.
Yes. Yep.
All right. And just east of the park, a little ways, the late Paul Guzik put up a couple of old truck bodies and painted it up to look like a caboose on a boxcar.
Yes, I know where that is. It's right after the campground.
Yes.
Yep.
I lived on that site at that time, 1967. He owned the property, but I was renting the property. I had a mobile home out there. Now, what I saw was a schooner rigged two-masted sailing vessel of modest size. You know what a schooner is?
I don't think so. No. Wow.
Aside,
Failing you here.
well, go look it up. The rigging styles of sailing vessels. But most of the sailing vessels on the Great Lakes were schooners, not square-rigged vessels. I could see people moving about on the deck. And I could even hear some voices coming from across the water. It was that close. The ship was not under full sail, suggesting that it was headed for the Ontonagon harbor and was dropping some of the canvas to reduce speed in preparation of entering the breakwaters. Now, the Ontonagon in 1967, there was no marina. Where visiting vessels came in, they went up the slough and tied up alongside of the north end of the island, right behind where Richard Whiteman has got his rock shop. Okay. My first thought was that this ship was some sort of reproduction of a 19th century lake schooner. I'm a nut on ships. I called my wife, and she came out, and she too caught a glimpse of the ship. I told her, I think it's heading into Ontonagon, and I really want to get a better look at it. So I jumped in our car. She stayed home. I jumped in our car and drove into the village and headed for the marina. By the way, my car at the time was a 1965 Plymouth Barracuda.
Nice.
At that time, the Ontonagon Marina was much smaller. It was located at the tip of the island and used the slough as a docking area. I drove into the lot behind the Gitche Gumi Oil Company, which it was at that time, and approached a gentleman who seemed to be in charge of the marina. And I asked him if the schooner had docked yet. He gave me a puzzled look and asked me what schooner I was talking about. I explained that from out near the township park, I had seen a two-masted schooner heading into port and was curious about who owned it and how old it was. Now, the gentleman I was talking to turned out to be the harbor master. I think his name was, I better not say the name because I'm not sure. The harbor master informed me that he had no idea which boat I was talking about and that there was no schooner that docked at Ontonagon. I looked out towards the lake and there was nothing approaching the harbor. The schooner that I had clearly seen just a few minutes before heading for the tip of the breakwaters wasn't there. Now, was this a mirage? A brief view into another time dimension? A replay of an image of the past? This type of schooner would be identical to a vessel called the George W. Ford that was owned by the famous mariner of Ontonagon, Captain John G. Parker. And there are pictures of that vessel. And it's what I saw. At the time, I knew only a few things about Ontonagon's maritime history. I'd only been here a little over a year. I was a band director. I was a school teacher. I wasn't into history like I am now.
Yeah. You're probably looking to get out of there.
And I learned that Ontonagon actually had two resident schooners, a ship called the Seaman, owned by Captain Daniel Beezer, and then two vessels owned by Captain John Parker. And the latter mariner, John Parker, is very well documented. He served as a mate on it, later purchased and operated the Fur Trader, which was a two-masted schooner, and that he bought from the American Fur Company in 1849. So these vessels actually existed. Parker had a contract to haul Minnesota mine copper to Sault Ste. Marie, which he did for over a year. And then the Fur Trader was wrecked, and he got another ship, the George W. Ford, and continued for years doing that. By the way, the George W. Ford has an interesting history too. He bought that ship in Milwaukee and brought it to Ontonagon. First, he had to come up Lake Michigan, had to come up the St. Mary's River, And at this point, there are no Sioux locks. So they literally picked this boat out of the water, put it on logs, and rolled it down the main street of Sault Ste. Marie, pushed it back into Lake Superior. A lot of vessels came into Ontonagon, were portaged that way, portaged around the falls. You didn't have the Sioux locks operating until 1855.
Wow.
So the George W. Ford was brought to Ontonagon by portaging, and it was a two-masted schooner, a modest size, although I think the ship I saw was somewhat smaller. And it was lost off of Eagle Harbor in 1870.
I was gonna ask if it had sank, but now it
Yes.
kind of makes sense.
That vessel sunk off of Eagle Harbor, and it went down, of course. And now, are you ready for this part?
Yeah, yeah, I am.
Years later, some folks from Ontonagon, Bruce Rudla, Diane Castle, who was a school teacher, and her then husband, Dan Castle, were into scuba diving. And they were scuba diving up there off of Eagle Harbor. And they saw a huge ship's anchor tangled in the ribs of an old vessel. Now, the anchor they saw was huge and was heavy, and certainly not of that vintage. But the anchor chain was tangled in the ribs of a sailing vessel, which evidently had gone down there sometime. They managed to salvage that anchor. They got floats on it. They brought it to the surface, and that is the anchor that sits out in front of the museum right now.
Oh my gosh,
Really?
that's
Yeah.
awesome! Wow,
So,
wow, that's incredible. I always
That's
wondered about that
amazing.
actually.
well, the only connection that anchor has to Ontonagon is that it was tangled in the wreckage and ribs of the George W. Ford that went down off of Eagle Harbor.
That is
That's very
absolutely wild.
interesting. That's awesome.
All sorts of little oddities and things you find out about Ontonagon if you hear, ask questions, and poke around. I've been a student of Ontonagon history now for over 60 years, and I've accumulated a lot of this stuff in my head. It'll probably die with me. Although I've written 5 books on local history, and of course you've read them all, haven't you?
I was gonna ask, are those published anywhere? Like, are they in just at
The
the
museum, probably.
museum and like maybe the library in Ontonagon? Anywhere else you can get them?
This land, the Ontonagon, which is actually the lectures that I gave to my 7th grade students in a course on local history. And that is available at the Ontonagon Museum.
Okay.
That is available. It's a large book, 211, 212 pages plus the index, and a lot of photographs with it. Another book I wrote was The River and the Land, which is basically a summary of Ontonagon County history. I wrote a history of the Victoria Mine, which has been reissued. That's also available at the Historical Society Museum. I forget after. Oh, yes, I almost forgot. A little book called Supernatural Tales and Hauntings
All
of the
right.
Ontonagon, which is also available in limited quantities from the Ontonagon County Historical Society.
All right. That is awesome. Well, I mean, we really do appreciate you coming and talking to us. I was glad.
And by the way, I don't get a dime for these books. I
Okay.
donated manuscripts to the Historical Society years ago for their profit.
Okay.
Wow.
Because we really want, I mean, obviously, us being from Ontonagon, we don't know, I mean, even a 16th of the information that you know, but always hearing about it is incredible, and that's kind of what we're doing here, is just letting our listeners kind of understand the history of Ontonagon, whether it's, quote unquote hauntings or all these wonderful stories that you've told us. I mean, it's nice getting that information out there to people that might not know about it.
Well, if you have any questions or if you want to discuss any other facets of Ontonagon history.
Well, if we have questions, we know where to go. Okay. Well, have a good night, Bruce. Thanks again for coming on.
Good evening, and don't let the entities haunt you.
Well, failures, how about that for an interview? Hope you guys did enjoy that, though. Bruce Johanson. It was very fun to do that with him. Great to hear all those stories, especially knowing that all of those are, well, tied into Ontonagon. But that's going to do it for episode 27. I hope you enjoyed your Halloween. You were safe. You didn't get any fentanyl in your Snickers. But next week, you have something to look forward to. We are going to do a full story recap of the Edmund Fitzgerald. So there's probably going to be some things that you didn't know about that you will learn from us. We're going to do some research. And, it's going to be a fun conversation. But have a great week, and I'll see you in the next one.
Dude, I turned.
Thanks for listening to Failure at its finest hour.
I saw a dude. There was a dude ripping fucking pills in the back room one time.
Thanks for listening to Failure at its finest hour.
Oh yeah, side story. Remember when we drug all the equipment out of the basketball court behind that place and blew the lid off the town?
Thanks for listening to Failure at its finest hour. Penguin! It was Penguin! Nice! Another perfect round. Thanks for listening to Failure at its finest hour.
Distinctively remember getting thrown to the ground when that first one blew up.